The text this morning from Isaiah comes again at that period of time when Israel was in the process of being uprooted from their homes and taken into exile. It was a time of trauma for them. Again, everything that they had counted on, everything that they had believed, everything that they thought they understood about God was being taken apart, dismantled, and destroyed. In the middle of that reading, the one line where it's Israel's voice. You know, it must be that we're just hidden from God's sight. That's why he doesn't seem to care too much about us or what's happening. And so you hear the voice of despair on the part of the people. It's going to be that voice of despair that Jesus' message about the reign of God, it will be that voice that Jesus will address. But what's interesting in this reading from Isaiah is that God speaks back to the people who, in the midst of their despair and in the midst of the world coming apart, it's as if God says, but don't forget, I'm still God. You may not think much about me, or you may be questioning my power to stop this terrible disaster from happening, but I'm still God. And in fact, the last lines are very powerful, right? That God is one who comes and lifts up. God is one who walks with. God is one who makes whole brokenness once again. And so it's hard, I'm sure, for the people of Israel to have been thinking about God in that way. But God says, take these words with you into exile, and maybe some point in the future you will remember them. And then you will fully understand that even in the midst of this despair, even in the midst of this brokenness, even in the midst of this disaster of going into exile, that I was still with you. I was still there in your midst. The importance of that is that in that time of exile, through their coming back and things not working out well for them, that various things happened for them. Various things in the sense that once the priest got a hold of the tradition, if you will, that the priest made it like many of us grew up with, reward and punishment. That if you don't follow the rules, you will be punished. If you keep the rules, you will be rewarded. And the priest thought this was how they could avoid any future disaster, because it seemed as if it was the immorality and the disobedience of the people that brought about the exile. Well, it might have been on a theological or spiritual perspective. But what had happened for the people of Israel is that they had forgotten, in the Exodus story, they had forgotten that they were to be different from all the other people. And the difference came in the way that they would shape their lives, their political life, their economic life, their social life, their religious life, that they would shape their life according to the vision of God. And simply put, look at the Ten Commandments. That's what it's about. You shall have no other God before God. In other words, no political leader should ever have the position of divine authority. No economic decider should have any power to take advantage of the poor and the lowly and the marginal. Think again, that's where you were in slavery in Egypt. Therefore, when you get into the land, you should not shape your life according to the way it was, but how it should be in the eyes of God, with the vision of God. Well, as exile and the ending of exile happened, that what occurred for the people of Israel was they were not different. They did things the way all the other nations did. Solomon built his great temple. Herod comes along and builds his great temple. The lives were now shaped more by Rome and the emperor of Rome, who did indeed think he was God. It was shaped more by the economics of expediency. And remember, by the time of Jesus, A good 80% of the people who lived on the land in Palestine were sharecroppers. They didn't own much of anything. Remember the parable of the sower? The suggestion in that is the farmer's happy that he gets 100% yield because already 80% of the yield is to go to the owner of the land, 10% is to go to the marketplace so that his family can eat, and the remaining few seeds that are left are to go to plant next year's crop. That was the economics of the day. That the people were not free. In fact, not only were they politically oppressed again by Rome, but they were economically depressed and socially in the same way that because of these rules and regulations that the priests set up for them, that it was the haves and the have-nots, who was in and who was out, who was clean and unclean, that it began to be a society that was stratified according to the way that one had wealth, had power, had position, had whatever they might have thought to be about cleanliness or uncleanliness, that the people, the majority of the people, well, you can imagine that in that despairing kind of situation, that they basically shut down. That all the system shut down. What's the point of protesting or resisting? Because Rome will, in the dark of night, come and take you off, like the thief in the middle of the night that will come and take you away because you stand in opposition to these oppressive policies of Rome. And the priest, well, all they have to do is see a freckle on your nose, and immediately you're excluded because you're a leper. And indeed, that's how leprosy was understood. It wasn't Hansen's disease per se, but it was any disfigurement, any discoloration of the person must mean that they are leprous. And so more and more people were being shoved to the edge because of these religious rules and regulations of purification and cleanliness. Cleanliness meaning, are you clean enough for God to enter into prayer in the synagogue or the temple? If you're not, then God's not going to care too much about you, the priest told the people. And so you can imagine in that situation of despair, despairing, hopelessness, it's almost as if God indeed is not present and that God doesn't care about you. Now, I want you to remember, again, the words of Isaiah. And you see, it's out of that great prophetic tradition of ancient Israel that Jesus comes at a significant moment in time. Perhaps right at that moment when, at the end of this, it's almost as if something has to happen. Something has to break. Something has to give. And he comes at that moment of high expectation that not only might a Messiah come to change the world in which they live, but some kind of liberator, some kind of person who would lift their spirit, open their lives, and once again, God would work on their behalf to free, to make whole, to, well, you can understand, to walk again with them. But they were numb. Numb meaning that when you only think that the world is the way it is, in despair and hopelessness, that there isn't much that you can hope for or expect. Last week we heard the message, and we'll hear it again in 2 weeks at the beginning of Lent. Jesus comes into the midst of this world, this political and economic and social reality of the lives of the people of Palestine, and speaks a word that intends to shatter and break that hopelessness and despair. That he says the reign of God is at hand. Don't you remember, people of Israel? God is walking with us. God will lift us up. God will care for us. God is about to do that once again, as God has always done for us. So awake, arise, once again, stand up. Because you are the special creation of God. You are the children of God. The message that Jesus gives intends not just to break their numbness and to open up the reality once again of God's powerful presence in their midst, but it's to remind them, as Moses and the ancient prophets try to remind them as people, that the world, if it's to be different from the way that Rome has created it, the way that the economic powers that be have created it, the way that the priests and the temple have created it, if it's to be different, then you need to let go of that world and step into the reign of God. While it might not immediately change things for you, at least just the spirit, the power of that compassion, that openness of God's life in your midst might be enough to ignite the flame once again of faith in the people. But as we all know, right? People can say words, and if there's nothing to back the words up, then after a while you just go, oh, they're just talking. It's just one of those talking heads again. Blah, 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 blah. And pretty soon you don't even hear anything more. But the gospel tells us that Jesus goes into the synagogue in Capernaum. And the man possessed by a demon announces that he knows, the demon knows who Jesus is. Why? Because the demon knows that his reign of terror and fear and hate is at an end. That's why the demon announces, look out, he's going to do something different. And the demon says, oh no, you don't have any power here, Jesus. And Jesus says, just wait. I have more power than you could ever imagine. Just wait. And the demon is driven from the man. And then he goes in this wonderful scene. Jesus goes into the house, and I've been to Capernaum, and anybody who's going to go to Israel next year, that this is not more than 20 feet from the synagogue to the house of Peter. 20 or 30 feet. And so he comes out of the synagogue and enters the house of Peter. And he's told about Peter's mother-in-law. Now here's something that the gospel doesn't tell you, and you need to understand about how powerful this story, because this is not just about a miracle. And sometimes, I'm sure, the people were praying for a miracle, as we all do. When my mother got lung cancer, I prayed for a miracle. God, free her from this cancer. And many of us have probably been in similar kinds of situations of praying for a miracle, that the laws of nature be suspended so that, God, you can make whole again what has come apart and what has become broken. And so we could look at this story just simply as a miracle story. The woman is healed. That's it. But remember again, as I keep reminding you, that every scripture has many entry points and levels of the story. And so on one surface level, it could be read simply as a story of a miracle, a healing that takes place. But then if you put this story into the context of first century Palestine, and we know that in that stratification world, that stratified world that the people were living in, where the priest had decided by setting up rules and laws of clean and unclean, that most certainly every woman in that Jewish society would have been labeled unclean, because you just never know when her period might show up, and she would be unclean, and so just don't associate with her. And so women were always in the secondary position, always excluded from full participation in the economic life of the community, let alone the religious and social life of the community. And on top of it, if you manifested any kind of illness or sickness, because they really didn't understand how things happened like that, and what the causes and what the circumstances of illness might be, that you have a double whammy against you if you're sick or ill. How many remember? I don't remember, but maybe some of you are old enough to remember times when a whole house might be quarantined because of illness. How many remember that? Yeah, a few of us, huh? Not everybody. Today we have a better sense of understanding these things, or maybe during the time of flu season like we've had, maybe we should have gone back to quarantining people. But in that time, that's what would happen. That the person who was ill would be quarantined, would be excluded, secluded into the furthest corner. Now, it works okay in our houses, right? If we've got private bathrooms and all the conveniences of life. But imagine in the first century when you didn't quite have that. And so in the darkest, dankest corner of the house lies Peter's mother-in-law. She's an unclean woman. She's ill. And therefore, she is excluded from the life not just of the family, but the life of the community. I need to show you that and to tell you that, because that's why this is not just a miracle story. But what I want you to see about the way the reign of God works, and this is what the people had become numb to, that God doesn't just kind of zap people and, I don't need to be involved with you. I don't need to be touching you. I don't need to be near you because I've got power and I'm just going to zap you and you're cured. And some of us do think that that's how God works. But the reign of God doesn't work that way. You see in the story, Jesus coming from outside enters inside, but not just inside the house. Jesus enters the very room where Peter's mother-in-law is. You need to know why that's important. Because you see, in crossing the boundaries that had been established by the priest for what is clean and unclean, Jesus says those are man-made laws and rules. God doesn't observe what you have established as separating and dividing people. God breaks through those divisions. And imagine, once again, every single layer of that society is being broken apart by Jesus entering into the very place where Peter's mother-in-law is. And on top of it, he has the nerve and the gall to touch her. Which, right? Makes him unclean. He touches her. But he doesn't just touch her. He grasps her hand. And in the Greek text, it's more like this. He grasps her by the hand and raises her up. Maybe because we don't know the Scripture well enough to get the significance of that. But in raising her up, it's like telling us already what's going to happen at the end of the story. That Jesus himself will be raised up from death. He will be raised up to life, to the fullness of life, where death no longer has any hold on him. And in grasping her hand and raising her up, what you need to know is not only does the disease go away, but she is raised again with the full recognition of who she is as a woman, an important part not only of her family, but an important part of the workings of that community of Capernaum. She is restored the full dignity of her humanity and restored once again her right to be involved in the social and political and economic life of that community. That's how God's reign works. It is not observant of the rules of separation and exclusion and who's in and who's out, who has and who doesn't have. That God's reign breaks through that, and in a tangible way, here's the evidence. It is not just words. It is the action and behavior of Jesus that takes the hand of an unclean, sick woman, 3 stripes, and recognizes her in her full dignity and importance in the life of that community. That's how God's reign. Remembering, again, the words of Isaiah, I will walk with you, and you will not grow faint, and you will not be weary, and we will run and play in the fullness of creation, because that's who I am as God. And behind it, you have to begin to think that the people are going to question what the priest had been feeding them for years, and what the economic forecasters and prognosticators have been telling you, you're good for nothing except to be sharecroppers. And what the political leaders have been telling you, that the emperor in Rome is God. And you have to ask, and what has the emperor in Rome done any good lately? God, that Jesus has announced his presence, has done tremendous things already, just in this one story. Enough that you see as he goes through the villages and towns, doing what God has always done for the people of Israel, of healing, making whole, liberating, setting free, that the people once again are understanding that the God that they have believed in for generations is now once again in their midst, and once again recognizing them as the special chosen ones. Not for setting apart, but for being agents and instruments of transformation in the world. You see, what happened in that little room in Capernaum is going to happen in the rooms in Rome, in the courts of the priests and the rabbis. It's going to begin to happen there too. And no longer will people be enslaved and oppressed, but will be free in the fullness of their dignity, and will enjoy the fullness of life in the world. That's what the reign of God does, is about, and what has happened in your own lives, and what can happen for everyone who believes and is open to